Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, and I want to thank you for joining us for this virtual panel discussion on the approaches that China and Russia have adopted towards the Middle East and North Africa. This event marches the launch of a new report from our Middle East programs entitled Great Power Projection in the Middle East, the China-Russia Relationship as a Force Multiplier. We're delighted to be joined by the report's authors, Jonathan Fulton and Li-Chen Sim, for today's discussion. As the international community focuses on Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and China's unfolding response, it's important to recognize that both countries have been increasing their influence in other regions, including the Middle East and North Africa. While China's been working to present itself as a major economic player that facilitates regional stability in MENA through strategic partnerships, it, along with Russia, also seeks to legitimize its authoritarian model and challenge the rules-based international order. Jonathan and Li-Chen's report offer intriguing analysis of the precise nature of Chinese and Russian efforts in MENA and their complementary security and economic strengths that collectively undermine U.S. interests and build support for a less liberal global order, despite an apparent lack of proactive coordination in their approaches. All of these aspects of the relationship have major implications for the future of the region, which is why we're having today's timely discussion. So with that, I'd like to introduce the authors. First, we have Jonathan Fulton, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs and assistant professor of political science in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. An expert on Chinese policy toward the Middle East, Jonathan Fulton has written widely on the topic for both academic and popular publications. He is the author of China's Relations with the Gulf Monarchies, editor of the recently released Routledge Handbook on China-Middle East Relations, and co-editor of External Powers and the Gulf Monarchies. Jonathan received his PhD from the University of Leicester, where his dissertation focused on Chinese relations with the Gulf Cooperation Council member states. And next we have Li-Chen Sim, an assistant professor at Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, and a non-resident scholar in the Middle East Institute, at the Middle East Institute. She holds a PhD in politics from Oxford and is a specialist in the political economy of Gulf and Russian energy and its intersection with domestic politics as well as international relations. Her research interests include the politics of energy in the Gulf, Gulf-Asia exchanges, and Russia-Gulf interactions. So welcome to you both. To kick off today's discussion, I'd like to invite both of our authors to share some initial remarks about the findings of this report. But before we start, I'd like to remind our audience to submit their questions via the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will try to raise some of them later on in our discussion. So let's get started. Jonathan, over to you.
Well, Dave, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for hosting the event. We're very excited to release this report. We've been thinking about it for a very long time. I'll talk a little bit about the process of how we got to this, and Li-Chen will talk about some of our key findings. So this is this is an outcome from a working group led by Ambassador Richard LeBaron that we've been a part of for over a year now. It involves folks from the Atlantic Council, the Institute for National Security Studies in Israel, and the Emirates Policy Center here in Abu Dhabi. And our working group is called the Chinese and Russian Power Projection in the Middle East team. And we've been meeting since early 2021. It's a group of scholars, think tankers, and analysts from across the region and beyond who are specialists on China and Russia and the Middle East. Our group is asked to consider three key questions. What are Chinese and Russian objectives in the Middle East, North Africa? What are their methods of influence? And how does this influence U.S. regional interests? And we've been getting together about once a month for the past year and a half, and having discussions, talking with folks about different aspects of this. Obviously, this has grown in importance. It's especially important given America's designation of each country, Russia and China, as a primary strategic competitors. And it's also grown in importance in recent years, just in what looks like shifting geopolitical alignments in the Middle East, where countries, especially that have had pretty dense partnerships with the US in recent years, have been looking to other partners. And I think the past month has really just made that a lot more clear to all of us. So Li-Chen and I, as I said, we've been thinking about this and working on it for quite a while. Our approach to writing this report was we wanted to develop a comparative analysis to measure each country's depth of engagement across four indicators. We're looking at what China and Russia are doing in political, economic, security, and public diplomacy terms. And basically, we asked ourselves 4 questions for this report. What tools do they use to achieve these objectives? How do they impact U.S. interests in the Middle East? And do they present a similar level of challenge to regional order and U.S. power across the Middle East? So hopefully, folks in the policy community will find it of interest. I think it's a very, very timely and interesting topic. I'll leave it to Li Chen to discuss some of our findings.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to Atlantic Council for hosting us. So let's talk a little bit about the findings. I'm going to just highlight 3 of the bigger, more significant findings here. And the first one would be that Jonathan and we actually found no evidence that China and Russia were proactively coordinating their activities in MENA, right? In other words, we didn't find any purposeful division of labor between the Chinese and Russians. It was not like they were sitting down and saying, you do this and I do this. We found that they don't actually compete against each other, either in a particular country in MENA or even in a particular sector in MENA to the detriment of each other. So we're trying to crack our brains to see if we could find a case that went against this finding. And I suppose the smallest, well, the only one I can offer, but it's not really a convincing case, is that of nuclear exports, right? Both China wants its nuclear companies to go out. Russia's Rosatom is already out here in the Middle East and elsewhere. And it's possible that they could compete in the future, but not anytime soon, which means maybe not, not in the next 10 years. So there's some possibility in Saudi Arabia, where China is assisting them with the uranium mining. Both Russia and China have signed MOUs, but so have many other different nuclear powers. But the program rollout in Saudi Arabia is really slow. There have been no tenders for reactors, etc. So we don't really. So I don't really see much happening in the way of competition. It's something that maybe on the horizon after about 10, 20 years we could see that, but not right now. The second finding from our research was that China and Russia, they both are keenly aware of their own strengths, and they actually play to these strengths, right? Whether that be in infrastructure or food or weapons. So just to give you a quick example, even if we look at, say, economic approaches, China is ace when it comes to infrastructure, financing, EPC, that kind of thing. Whereas Russia is largely absent from that sector. Whereas if you look at food, Russia is very much present as a wheat exporter, as a barley exporter, as fertilizer exporter. But China, again, is nowhere in the picture. So they each have their own strengths and they play to these strengths. Our third finding would probably be about how we find that bilateral and multilateral ties are actually quite well institutionalized in MENA. So you have things like the China-Africa Forum, China-Arab States Forum, China-GCC forums, and you have similar institutions on the Russian side. Now, this is important because it speaks to the intentions to institutionalize these relationships, have them filtered down through the bureaucracies of these countries, and add a bit more permanence and a long-term relationship to China, Russia, and the Middle East. They all have special envoys, for example. So we see it as quite institutionalized and not just depending on personal ties between the top leaders. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Dave.
Great, thank you, Li Chen. I think now we'll just dive into some questions for the panel. And I think the first one I have is kind of building off what you just laid out, Li Chen, about how China and Russia seem to have different objectives in the Middle East, and that they have different priorities and certainly strengths. So I'm curious, to ask both of you, what do you think is the biggest distinction in terms of Chinese and Russian priorities in the Middle East?
Jonathan, if you don't mind, I'll start. From my point of view, the biggest distinction is the biggest distinction in terms of priorities would be that Russia is very much top on the list of priority is to project, maintain, or even better still, enhance their great power status in the Middle East. So it's very much tied to their global gains, right? To their global aims. Now, this is a really, really important aim for Russia because they want to be seen as being active, and not just in the post-Soviet era, post-Soviet area, but also that they are able to project power beyond the post-Soviet states. They are able to project power in the Middle East as well, right? And this adds to Russia's reputation. This adds to its standing in the world. So I find that Russia is less, it doesn't prioritize economic objectives as much. If it did, then the MOUs that it has signed with a lot of the Middle Eastern states, they would be implementing this at a faster clip. But we see that the MOUs are normally signed trying to signal a certain intention or trying to signal certain messages to the US, for example, in the region. But if it was an economic priority, they would actually implement these a lot faster. So my argument would be that power projection beyond the immediate, post-Soviet area is something that's really, really important to them.
Sure. So, and then in terms of what China's doing, they are totally playing an economic game for now. Its presence across the region has largely been economics driven. I think this is really interesting. You can see in different regions throughout the Middle East, there are certain places that it prioritizes, but it's still playing the same game across the region, trying to develop its base in trade and finance and contracting. And you find this really just across North Africa, across the East Mediterranean, across the Gulf, where China tends to be among the top 3 or 4 import partners for every country, and among the top 10 export destinations for everyone. So it's really playing an economics-driven game. The other thing I think that's different about China is its Belt and Road. This is something that has really given, I think, the Middle East a larger picture in China's overall strategic ambitions. China is looking at increasing its influence and power across the Indian Ocean region, Eurasia, and into the Med. And I think the Middle East has clearly been highlighted as a pretty important part of that. So China, I think, has more of a carefully articulated vision of how it sees the Middle East fitting in its overall plans.
Yeah, great. I think those are really obviously very important distinctions, and that's kind of see that throughout the report and the implications that has. I want to build on something that Li Chen said about Russia's priorities and how they focus on big power projection and their reputation in the region. So given what we're all watching unfold right now in Ukraine with Russia's invasion, I'm curious, you note in the report that Russia has been largely successful in inserting itself into MENA affairs, and its views are sought and considered by states in the region. So, in what ways do you think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's response is going to impact Moscow's relations in the Middle East? And then more broadly, what bearing do you think this war is likely to have on China-Russia interactions and views of each other's moves in the Middle East? So I'll open that up to either one of you. Maybe start with Li Chen. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So yes, we just jump right into the Russia-Ukraine war. It's fantastic. I think that the war is going to, I don't think it will greatly change relations between Russia and some of its key Middle East partners, because the relations are built on quite fundamental grounds according to them. So one of the things would be, for example, coordination over energy markets, whether it's oil or the gas exporters forum, so OPEC Plus or gas exporters forum. They are likely to want to continue this kind of cooperation. It's been a big modus operandi for Russia, for example. Of course, the question then comes, is the war going to make Russia obsolete as a player in OPEC plus? And the answer to this question would be, well, it really depends on what happens to Russian oil and gas, right? Whether it's going to be fully sanctioned rather than just at the moment self-sanctioned with buyers just avoiding oil, but it's still legal to buy Russian oil. So the future of OPEC plus and Russia's key node in which it interacts with some of these Gulf exporters, that would be something that's really interesting to watch. The other way in which I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine will impact upon its relations to the Middle East is, I think it's going to add a bit more competition between Russia and the Middle East, especially over companies that can act as an alternative supplier for certain Russian produce to Europe. And for this, I have in mind things like aluminum companies here in the Middle East. You have them in Bahrain, for example, you have them in the UAE, steel companies in Turkey, you have Egyptian companies in fertilizers, etc. So these companies, these Middle East companies that are able to provide an alternative to Russian products that are currently going to Europe, I think this would be, it would add a bit more competition between Russian and Middle East companies. Because Europe is going to want to buy less of the Russian products. So there are opportunities for greater cooperation, but I think also we have to realize that there will be some forms of conflict. And as for the impact on Russia-China relations, I'll leave it to Jonathan to start maybe, and I can always jump in a little later.
Thanks, Li-Chen. That was great. One other thing I'd highlight that in our report, and Li-Chen's already referred to this, is the importance of Russian wheat exports to the region. And obviously, I think this is something that we're all looking at as a long-term problem, long-term being, later this year. Ukraine and Russia together are so important for global wheat exports. And you just imagine a scenario in the Middle East and at the end of a harvest that we don't see coming from Ukraine and a lot of food scarce countries with poor economies, and you can see the potential for some pretty disastrous political outcomes across the region. I just keep thinking about before the Arab Spring, every day I was reading stories in the newspaper about how food shortages in Egypt were leading to bread lines and bakeries, and we all know how that played out. So I wonder if in a few months' time, leaders around the region might be thinking differently about this. But to the question of how it's affected the China-Russia relationship, from a purely selfish perspective, Li-Chen and I started writing this last fall. The guiding premise is that these countries aren't allies, they're not acting in tandem. China it's got a non-alliance partnership. It doesn't pursue alliances with anybody. So when Putin and Xi met in Beijing during the Olympics, and they made this statement about, this partnership without limits, I thought, oh my goodness, do we have to go back and change everything? Which, is just me as an academic being selfish, thinking, oh, I don't want to have to revise the report. But then with this invasion, I think that this has actually really highlighted some of the limits on this relationship, because there was so much analysis in the beginning saying this is going to be an opportunity for China to go into Taiwan, that you're going to see a lot of aggression out of Beijing while everybody's watching Ukraine. I think what Beijing has seen is the tremendous cost that Russia's enduring from the international community. And China's government, with this performance legitimacy model where the economy is everything, they're in no position to endure these type of sanctions. I think they've seen what it would cost them to engage in any kind of aggression similar to Russia. And I think this really just raised the cost in a lot of the strategic thinking of folks in Beijing. In terms of how China maybe is looking at Russia, well, I think Russia has become quite vulnerable, economically, that it's very exposed. And of course, China is one country that they're looking at as an economic lifeline. And I don't expect they can, I don't think they should anticipate any great favors from Beijing, that they're going to probably be looking for very good pricing on Russian gas and Russian corn, because they know that Russia's options are pretty limited. And I think this is just going to underscore that it really is, to me, more of a fair weather friendship than any kind of enduring, deeper geopolitical alignment.
Great, thank you to both of you. Those were really rich comments and covered a lot of the territory that I kind of wanted to get to in terms of the effect on food security, and of course diving in here, as you did, Jonathan, into the difference between an alliance and what you describe in the report as a force multiplier in the region. And so, I'd ask either one of you to kind of share a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about China and Russia being force multipliers in the Middle East. And then an additional kind of question is, to what extent do you think the Middle East might perhaps, and Jonathan, you kind of already addressed this, but to what extent the Middle East might be a bit of an outlier, given, as you note, that for both countries, the region isn't the top priority for either country?
Yeah, do you want to take that one, Li Chen?
Sure, yeah, I can do that. So what does it mean when it says that they are force multiplier? Well, it just means that one amplifies the effect of the other, and also it amplifies the cost for the US of trying to deal with either of these separately. So maybe let me give an example. Say if the US is worried about Russian impact on the defense and security fields here in the Middle East. If the US is concerned that the Russians are selling S-400s and etc. to Turkey, possibly to Qatar, possibly to Saudi Arabia, the UAE has then several years ago turned around and said, hey, we'd like some Sukhoi jets, please. So US would probably think, okay, we can kind of deal with that, because we think that this is just messaging on the part of the UAE, since no Sukhoi jets have actually been exchanged or developed. But then the force multiplier effects comes in when the UAE then says, right, we'll also take a dozen Chinese fighter jets, right, which they've recently done. So again, this adds to the cost again of for the US of are we going to just leave space for these actors to do their stuff, right? Is there an additional cost on this? Should we say more that these two actors are amplifying each other? So it just makes it more difficult for the US to have to deal with it when it could have dealt with Russia separately or China separately. Now these two are coming in. It kind of looks like they're coming in together on the same issue, defense in this case. And so I could also give you other examples, but it's a very similar idea when you look at military exercises. Rather than just the Middle East having military exercises with China, now it's also having military exercises with Russia. So once again, it amplifies the effect for domestic audiences as well, that, hey, maybe the US is not as powerful and influential in this region if it's not just Russia, but China that is having military exercises here in this region. Jonathan, would you like to add something?
Yeah, so I mean, the interesting thing about the scenarios or the examples you just gave is that it's not really enhancing their own power in the region, but diminishing America's, right? They're making America work a lot harder to achieve the same stuff that it used to be able to do pretty effortlessly. So that seems to be something we see a lot. Again, they're not allies, but they both have this concern about a US dominated international order. Russian leaders often talk about creating a oh my goodness, Li Chen, what's the phrase? It's what order? Not a unipolar. It's a not multipolar,
Polar.
but this, you get the idea. And China keeps saying a more democratic world order. Basically what they're saying is they don't want US to set the rules of the game. And in the Middle East, it just seems to be a theater for where they are not operating in concert, but they both have similar objectives. It's not to be a major player in the Middle East per se, because like you rightfully said, Dave, that this isn't a core objective for either country. China's engaged, China's focusing on East Asia or South Asia. Russia's focusing on Europe. The Middle East is a place where they're able to achieve some objectives. And one of them, I think, is to put the US on its back foot.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I want to build on what you said about, common views of the global order, right? So at the beginning of the report, you both state that it's one of the report's starting points is that neither China or Russia are revisionist powers out to upend the current international order. But you also highlight in the report ways in which the countries are looking to eviscerate the liberal underpinnings of the current order by, establishing a consensus in the region on non-Western political norms, or using regional public diplomacy to promote their values as an alternative to liberal democracy, and building the sorts of multilateral forums you already mentioned to get support for efforts to weaken human rights protections in international institutions. So can either of you say a little more about how you make the distinction between these actions and what you would view as representing a more fundamental effort to revise the current order? Maybe Li Chen, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. Very, very good question. So it depends on what you define by the international order, right? What you just mentioned, Dave, would be what the Russians and the Chinese would call the liberal international order, right? Not just an international order, but a liberal international order. Whereas for the Russians and the Chinese, what they're more focused on is the post-1945, what they would like to see as the international order without the word liberal being inserted there, right? So it's not about democracy. I mean, it's not fully about democracy or human rights, but it's just about an international order that has, certain rules, certain obligations, and that kind of thing. So I think that's the distinction which they're trying to make. So they would like order, but not a liberal international order, right? So I think it is quite important to see that, at least for us, Russia, obviously much more than China, wants to change the liberal international order that you've described, right? They would also like to keep certain rules. Not all rules, obviously. They want some spheres of influence, so that's going to go against some part of the international order. But I don't really see them wanting to tear up everything. They still like the United Nations to an extent because it helps protect the veto power, etc. So they would like certain aspects of that, but I think they just would like to get rid of certain of the more liberal characteristics that you've described.
Yeah, I think with China, I mean, it's hard to think of another country that's been benefited more, other than, of course, the US, from the existing order. If you look at how China's developed over the past 40 years, they found this order very much to their liking. Like Li Chen, I think the bigger issue is just the normative underpinnings of it. These liberal, characters that, of course, came from the U.S. and Europe. I think what you see is these countries working to just change some of those normative elements, and the Belt and Road to me seems to be just that. And what's interesting to me is living here in the Middle East for quite a while. I think you'll find a very receptive audience, because the liberal characteristic, is not something a lot of countries in the global South are very comfortable with. We often fool ourselves in thinking that this is a universal set of assumptions. And I teach comparative politics to Emirati students this semester. When we talk about liberal democracy, they are very aware of it, but they don't see it as something that they find especially useful in and of itself. So I think when China and Russia talk about changing some of the normative underpinnings of this, especially in this region, you'll find countries and societies and more importantly, political leaders who say, you're speaking a language that's really attractive to me.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point. The relevance of what China's and Russia are, pushing in terms of their alternate version of a global order, and we saw that very clearly in the joint statement, and how that aligns nicely, especially in this region, with the views of the resident governments in power. So thanks for that. So Jonathan, I want to build on something you noted earlier. You noted the report discusses 4 specific pathways of Chinese and Russian influence in the Middle East, right? Political, economic, security, and public diplomacy. And you've touched on this a little bit, but I want, if you could expand a little bit on which of these you think is most concerning for U.S. interest in the Middle East, and why?
Right. So, I mean, the thing that maybe I would say is most concerning would probably be surprising. I'd say that's the economic part of it, but not as a whole. I think the nature of a lot of the economic engagement in the region, specifically in tech and things like this. There was a statement last, I guess, August from an official at the DoD saying, we know you're going to engage economically with China. We do as well. but certain types of engagement are counter to our interests, especially when they cross over into these technological realms, which have an impact on critical infrastructure or on things like AI or other things that really do, I think, threaten some of the types of security engagement the U.S. has in the region. Not only on the security realm, but it also does indicate, if China is setting the standards in a lot of these sectors right now, the impact is going to be felt for decades, right? If they're setting, things on internet or digital technology, or fintech or AI or digital currencies. I mean, that's not just a matter of economic engagement. That's actually setting standards that are going to be to Beijing's benefit. And I think that's something that Washington probably sees as more threatening than if China were to be building bases, really.
Li-Chen, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I do actually. If you were to ask which is the most concerning for US interests in the Middle East in terms of Russia's pathways of engagement, most people would probably say, oh, it's security, right? Russia sells a lot of weapons and arms to the Middle East, particularly to Algeria, for example, or to Syria. So that's, could certainly be a key challenge to US interests in the Middle East. But I would actually propose something else for you to consider, and that would be in the long term to see public diplomacy by Russia in the long term as actually most concerning for sustained US interest in the Middle East. Why? Because Russia's public diplomacy in terms of, say, their media sites, whether online or broadcast media, where you have Sputnik or RT in Arabic language to boot, right? They are actually quite effective in kind of like whittling down reservoirs of goodwill, about US influence in the region. So I think that in the long run, this is actually should be quite concerning for US interests, if it's in the US interest to stay here in a long time, because public opinion here, turns quite easily on these kinds of online sites. They love conspiracy theories. They're not big readers, so they really like to go through to this kinds of mediums to get information. And I think Russia is actually particularly effective when it comes to what they call black PR and all kinds of ways to undermine support for the US in this region. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And the report lays out, as you just did, the impact of Russian public diplomacy and black PR, and notes the at least traditional differences between the way that Russia uses global social media and uses propaganda and uses disinformation from the way China traditionally has done, which is more about a positive message about China and less the kind of black PR that you're talking about. But we have seen in the last 2 years, China sliding more in that direction in terms of using disinformation, specifically anti-US, anti-democracy messaging, right? So I'm curious, specifically in this region, in the Middle East and North Africa, do you see more in terms of commonality around Chinese and Russian messaging? Do you see them kind of building off each other's messaging around topics? Do you see them sharing platforms? So Li-Chen, I'd ask you to maybe start with that.
Sure. Unfortunately, I don't speak Arabic, so I couldn't, be a personal witness or bear personal testimony to it. But from friends who do speak Arabic and from researchers in this region, there really isn't a great deal of coordination. It's not like, hey, look, I've done this segment on RT, China TV. Would you like that? And would you like to build off it? So I and some of the researchers have done this, don't actually see this kind of coordination. But yes, their messaging has been, quite consistent. I think that's probably what you're getting at. It's not exactly that they share documentaries and stuff, but the messaging tends to be quite consistent. And I think if we look outside of the Middle East to the example right now in Ukraine, you see that they echo similar messages, right? But not necessarily, coordinating and say, look, this is how we're going to promote a certain line. It's just that they seem to have common interests that would benefit from a similar messaging.
Great. Jonathan, anything to add on that?
Well, just a shameless plug. I have a podcast with Atlantic Council of China Media Podcast, and last night we recorded an episode with a prof here in the UAE named Xiaojin Chai, and we talked about China's efforts at projecting its soft power into the region. And the way you characterize it, I think, is pretty spot on. I mean, it's more about really about kind of propaganda, about increasing positive views of China and highlighting things that they want people to see about it. You did see, especially from more of a defensive posture, when the Trump administration during the COVID pandemic was swinging at China. China started putting a lot of Arabic language messaging out on YouTube and on social media, on Instagram, where they'd have fluent Arabic speaking Chinese nationals giving very kind of ham-fisted cartoon images of the Statue of Liberty getting sick with COVID and blaming it on Donald Trump and saying, why do they blame us? It's not our fault that you don't know how to manage this pandemic. It was really, but it really did seem like a very, not what we're talking about with the black ops where they're trying to manipulate people. This was just a very ham-fisted, like, don't blame us. So you don't really see the same type of engagement that you see with Russia in that realm.
Yeah, very interesting. So before we go to audience questions, I just want to ask, I think, one more question of my own, which is, you note in the report that it doesn't focus much on how Middle East and North African officials and publics perceive and respond to the notion of their region as a theater of great power competition now, right? But you do quote an Emirati advisor commenting, "We're all worried very much about a looming Cold War. This is bad news. Choosing is problematic in the international system. It's not going to be an easy ride." And then you also note that at the same time, having more options for these countries or for, countries around the world can be helpful, right? That they can benefit from this and find opportunities. So, I'm curious, on balance, how do you think people are viewing this in the region in terms of the pluses and negatives? And how do you think this will potentially play out over the months and years to come? Li Chen, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. Well, I guess it depends who you ask, right? I mean, the Middle East and North Africa is a huge number of countries. So since you mentioned North Africa, I'll just jump to one example. Say Egypt, for example. If you're going to ask Egypt, how is this going to play out? They're kind of sitting on the fence at the moment. But I think they're slowly going to start feeling very uncomfortable as wheat prices hit in Egypt. As say certain barley prices hit because they have cattle, they export cattle. So I think if you have these kinds of considerations, but then it has to be balanced against other things that Russia brings into Egypt. So for example, energy, right? In this case, nuclear, they're building a nuclear power plant. So that has to be considered, as well as tourism. Russian tourists love Egypt and Turkey as well. What's not to love about sun, sand, and beach. So that's going to have an impact. The Russian-Ukraine war is going to have an impact on the tourism industry because Russians will be traveling less because that's probably going to be impact on the GDP. There's going to be less possibility for them to travel because of certain air restrictions, because it's going to find it difficult to spend money because they're out of the SWIFT system, etc., etc. So I think even North African countries like Egypt is going to be greatly impacted on the war. And so they're going to have to balance off, some of the, food interests with the energy kind of interests.
Jonathan, anything to add on that?
Yeah, just that statement you gave came from presidential advisor Anwar Gargash here in the UAE, and I believe that was back in September. And when they were talking about the Cold War, the looming Cold War that you cited, this is something that folks in the region have been talking about, for quite a while, since I'd say about 2019, when Huawei started, dominating the narrative, and the U.S. started, I think, highlighting some of the things about Chinese practice in the region that they would like their allies and partners to reconsider. I think when Gulf leaders thought of this as a binary, China or US, it seemed maybe more manageable but when you add in, I don't think anybody expected Russia, like, for Russia to jump into the mix like this, I think has really altered the thinking of a lot of actors. And I think it's going to probably make things a lot more complicated, a lot more uncomfortable, because it does really seem to pose a much more stark choice on these countries, right? Like when you watch the news and you see theaters being bombed, or you see hospitals or nuclear power plants, it makes it hard to justify. So I think the when it's just a Cold War between China and the U.S., they think, oh well, we can use this, right? We can play one off the other. This, I think, is something different. It's probably a little more dangerous.
Thank you so much to our panelists, Jonathan and Li Chen, for I think a very rich discussion about this important topic. Thank you to our audience and for participating actively and for some great questions. The Atlantic Council will be continuing to do a lot of work in this domain: China, Russia, China, Middle East, and we look forward to engaging you in the future in events. And please also tune in to Jonathan's podcast, which is really fantastic. So thanks very much, and we'll see you again soon. Have a good day.